Well, everybody, it is finally here. This is the DeepCool Assassin IV, the successor to probably one of, if not the best air coolers on the market today, and that is the Assassin III. Now, you saw this thing first at CES, then you saw the white version at Computex, and yes, that white version is coming out in August or September of this year. Stay tuned for that. But we finally got in the Assassin IV for some proper benchmarking, which is why I wanted to sort of hop onto the camera right now, right after we unboxed it. This hasn't even gone on the test platform yet. But anyways, I'm obsessed with air cooling, so of course I'm excited about this thing. But you know what else I'm obsessed with? That is this case from Antec.
Leave uncertainty behind for something that is guaranteed to last. The new P20 series grants unlimited upgrades with roomy insides, dual 360s, metal front mesh for good airflow, and 4 models to choose from. Check out Antec down below.
All right, with that out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about DeepCool's design process here, because it's really hard to one-up the Assassin III, because it is at the pinnacle of air cooling design, even currently on 13th gen and Ryzen 7000 series processors. But there were a couple of little issues with it, I guess. First of all, the memory compatibility was a little bit limiting. It's also quite bulky. The other thing is that if you look at the sort of like Assassin IV versus the Assassin III, it does not necessarily mesh too well with DeepCool's current design language. The new Assassin IV, on the other hand, that aims to address every single one of those minor issues, but it also goes for $100 US, so about $10 more than its predecessor. And what you get is probably one of the most unique looking air coolers around. It's a sleek and streamlined design that perfectly hides the fact you have a massive hunk of metal installed on your motherboard. And yes, all that cladding does add up, so this actually weighs more than the previous Assassin. So even though this is a typical dual tower design with 7 6mm heat pipes and a super well finished base, it uses a pretty unique fan setup. Instead of the usual push-pull configuration you see on a lot of air coolers, the front fan is completely eliminated. Other than the obvious super clean visual benefit, this setup also gave DeepCool the ability to offer 100% RAM height compatibility without sacrificing heatsink size. Anyways, this is a pull-pull configuration with a center 140mm fan and a back-mounted 120mm unit that hangs out over the motherboard's I/O zone. If you have a board with a massively built-up area here, the fan can be moved upwards, so clearance issues haven't necessarily been avoided altogether, they've just been moved from the memory to here. But there's a downside too. Regardless of how well you tune a fan, running it in a pull configuration will generally lead to more overall noise. There's also a little switch on the top that toggles between silent and extreme modes with a visual indicator of a brighter DeepCool logo in the higher performance mode. Meanwhile, if it's dim, you know the cooler's running at an RPM cap of 1200, and just take note, that's what it does straight out of the box. Now, in order to get access to that 140mm center fan and the mounting bolts in the middle, it's actually simpler than you might think. First of all you have to do is yank off this top cover, which has magnets on it, then pinch 2 little brackets inside and start pulling out the fan. That's pretty much it. To get it back in again, you simply push it until it clicks, then your top cover goes right back on. That's it, easy peasy. And speaking of installation, there's absolutely nothing to complain about, since you get a pre-installed retention arm on the cooler itself, so literally half the battle is won already. Then there's the bare minimum of mounting hardware, and bless their hearts, a double-headed screwdriver that also has a grippy surface. But why do you really need a double-headed screwdriver? So one side you have your standard Phillips head that everybody uses in the PC industry. On the other side, you get a Torx head. Now, why is that Torx head here? Well, there's a reason for it. It is because of, hold on a second, this thing. So, this is a bracket that DeepCool gives you that is supposed to mount a optional 120mm fan. Now, this is another DeepCool fan. This doesn't actually come with the cooler. But this thing, it feels like a completely last-minute addition, and it runs contrary to a lot of the high-quality engineering and fabrication processes that have gone into the Assassin IV. So here we are, and you might notice a couple of little changes around here. First of all, there's not one, there's 2 samples of the Assassin IV, because after recording that initial portion, we ended up starting our very intensive testing routine, and we encountered a pretty major issue with the first sample. Take a listen to this, guys. So if you were listening closely enough, you'll have noticed between 1,200 and 1,300 RPM, a very distinctive vibration started coming from the Assassin IV. And for me, that was a major red flag, because I actually had some hands-on time with this cooler in a quiet room at CES. And I knew right away, with that one being so quiet, that there was something wrong with our sample. Of course, I needed to reach out to DeepCool, giving them the right to respond to this before publishing, because I would rather have correct results rather than be the first to have a review out. Anyways, they came back with some solid evidence that samples initially sent out to some, but not all reviewers, were from a faulty pre-production run that they just didn't catch. So I requested another sample, but only if it came from their mass production run. That's why it took an additional 2 weeks to reach us. Basically, I wanted something that you guys would be buying, not something that was basically rushed into reviewers' hands. And that's exactly what they did. So I can confirm that the second sample is a complete retail package that came from one of DeepCool's distributors down in the US. So it's not like they sent us some sort of hand-picked golden sample. And you know what? This thing is a heck of a lot quieter than the first one. Subjectively, I guess you can all breathe a sigh of relief, because this is actually one of the quietest coolers, to my ears at least, that we've ever tested. But that sort of stops at 1400 RPM, because if you were listening closely enough, there's sort of like this weird, faint, almost inaudible buzzing that comes from somewhere inside of the Assassin IV around 1,400 RPM. So basically, it's not catastrophic whatsoever, but it's something that people have to take into account if they want to be running this thing at higher fan speeds, which, by the way, you shouldn't, because you're probably buying this thing for silence to begin with. So anyways, let's line up both of these coolers next to one another, because that really tells an interesting story. Because from 500 to 1200 RPM, the two samples were essentially identical. Then at 1300 RPM and higher, the point where vibration started on the first sample, the second sample is able to run at lower noise levels. That ability to run at higher RPM at a comparatively lower decibel level will give it a pretty big advantage. So what exactly is happening here? And look, I've got a theory, even though we tried to nail down exactly where the sound was coming from on both of these coolers, and we sort of failed. But anyways, this is a very different cooler from everything else that's on the market right now. Everything else is literally two fin stacks with two fans slapped onto them. This, on the other hand, there's a ton of materials that go into the shroud, that go into the internal brackets and everything else. So naturally, you have a bunch of material junctions that aren't being dampened properly, and at higher fan speeds at least, something's gotta give, even on an otherwise pristine sample from the retail space. Anyways, with that being set up, let's move to cooling results. And I'm gonna be using both coolers here, since there's a chance that among the tens of thousands of retail units, some might fall between our original sample and the second one in terms of noise levels. Starting with gaming, and because of its vibrations, the pre-production sample is actually one of the loudest coolers we've ever tested, topping out at 46 decibels. And because of that, its decibel normalized performance just isn't all that great. Meanwhile, the mass production sample ends up with identical performance and lower noise levels, but then jumps way ahead at 38 decibels and above. But I also want to address the elephant in the room. While these numbers are very, very good in regards to other high-end air coolers, the Assassin IV gets demolished by the Assassin III, D15, Frost Spirit, and at times even the Peerless Assassin. And that fact hits home at 38 decibels, since it just feels like the two fans just can't provide enough access to fresh air with the GPU dumping its heat into the case. Honestly, I wasn't expecting the new Assassin to lose by a whole 6 degrees to its sibling here. The effect on frame rates, well, there's absolutely none, since every cooler lands within our margin of error, moving to a full core load of 180 watts, and the Assassin IV does much better, but only at higher RPM levels, since it still struggles at lower noise when compared to the top 4 coolers in our charts. That's a bit concerning since it's a heck of a lot more expensive than the Frost Spirit and Peerless Assassin. Sure, it nudges into the top 5 here, but there's still a pretty wide gap separating it from the best of the best. Clock speeds are about what you'd come to expect from those temperatures too. The Assassin IV doesn't have the best frequencies, and it doesn't have the worst either. And yet, you also have to remember we're talking about just under 50 megahertz separating something like the DT24 from the Frost Spirit, which means at 180 watts, none of these high-end coolers is really being pushed. So let's push things to 253 watts, and you can really see the Assassin IV starting to get its groove on, especially focusing solely on the mass production sample. It's definitely one of the top 5 high-end air coolers on the planet right now, especially as noise levels increase. There's still a challenge for the new Assassin when it's running quieter though, since those top heat sinks end up being a solid 2 to 3 degrees cooler. And considering temperatures matter less and less for performance these days, it's good to see this cooler within 10 to 20 megahertz of the Assassin III. But does it beat the older version? Well, no, it actually doesn't. On the flip side of that coin, if you're willing to sacrifice a bit of noise, it gets some of the highest clock speeds we've ever seen here. So overall, if you want super clean looks and top shelf performance in an all-core workload, the new Assassin is a solid choice if you're willing to pay for that combination. And removing the 13900K's limits results in exactly what you'd expect. Every cooler running to its 100-degree T-junction. But drilling down into the clock speeds shows something very different. The mass production Assassin basically bridges the gap between lower performing coolers and the better ones. It isn't really going to dethrone the Assassin III D15 or any of the Thermalrights for that matter. So if you care about a combination of near silence and low temperatures, there are definitely better air cooling options out there, and some of them they even cost less too. So those are the stock config results, and I promise you one thing at the beginning of this video, and that would be to test this in the optional triple fan configuration. Remember, DeepCool does give you that bracket for it. So what we ended up doing is we ended up grabbing a DeepCool FK series 120mm fan and see what happens when this thing sort of like goes balls to the wall. And that gave us a solid 2.5 degree improvement at 38 decibels over the stock config. And to me, that points towards the Assassin IV simply being a bit starved for airflow in its current pull-pull setup. Well, with all of that out of the way, where do I stand on the Assassin IV? And this is a little bit of a tough one for me because I came into this review with admittedly high expectations. I know a lot of you guys had ultra high expectations too for this 4th generation Assassin, given what the previous generations did. And I have to say that first sample that we got really did put a damper on things. Meanwhile, the second sample, that was quite a bit of a redemption story. The main problem with that is that with 2 samples, it's a relatively small sample size, and I really have to question, with thousands and thousands of these things in the retail channel, where will the Assassin IV ultimately lie? Based on DeepCool's responses, the second sample should be representative of what's going to be on store shelves. And yet, when it comes to any product that costs as much as this one, having any doubts whatsoever is very concerning. Yet one thing carried from the initial sample to the new one. At low RPM levels, this is an extremely quiet cooler. The only issue is that it needs those high fan speeds to deliver its most competitive results. Look, I think what DeepCool did here is pretty obvious. They maximized memory compatibility and gave us one of the most uniquely designed heat sinks on the planet, but ended up sacrificing a bit of performance to get there. So in the end, does the Assassin IV dethrone all of those kings of the air cooling world like the Assassin III, like we all hoped it would? And unfortunately, contrary to DeepCool's marketing claims, the answer to that is no, it doesn't. But what it does do is something that's pretty unique at its performance level, and that is offer 100% memory compatibility and these super clean looks. It doesn't look like this massive hunk of metal just hanging off your motherboard. So if you value those two things, it does offer extremely good performance. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this review finally of the Assassin IV, and I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys.